glad to have with us Imogen Dickie from the University of Toronto, Canada. Imogen is going to give a talk which perfectly fits one of the Mumble Research Group research program, and in particular the one that has been financed by our national government concerning the mark of the mental. For, as you may know, in this program, we want to investigate whether there is something that unites, so to speak, whatever is mental and explains why what we rank as mental is actually mental. And one of the things that historically have been considered to be such a mark, although of course this is an idea that is quite disputable, is aboutness, or this is what Brentano originally said. And I'm very glad to have Imogen with us today, for Imogen works at the intersection between philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. She published in 2015 a book by Oxford University Press called Fixing Reference. That's to do, of course, with a theme that is very well known and studied in philosophy of language, but not only in philosophy of language, for it immediately goes back to what in the mind allows us to think about the objects that we refer to. And in fact, she has also published many papers. I guess that you have a forthcoming new book precisely on this issue, if I remember correctly. But she also has some new papers on more or less this kind of topics as addressed from the philosophy of mind perception perspective, in particular one that has been that's come out last year again in a volume edited for Oxford University Press that is called the volume Mental File and Singular Thoughts. And Imogen's paper is called The Cognitive Focus. Today she's talking, this is the 17th seminar of our Mumble seminars this year, so we are particularly proud of having had such a long list of seminars, and we are very happy to conclude this list this year, this series with Imogen's talk, whose title is Representation of Objects and the Goal of Ordinary Cognition. So Imogen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be talking to you all. So what I'm going to do is present what are the new foundations for this view that I have that the aboutness of our ordinary thoughts is a matter of being focused in a way that I'll explain on things outside the mind. So I'm going to start with a claim that I'm going to pre-dignify by calling it a lemma. I'm going to argue for the claim, and then I'm going to use it in an argument, which is what makes it a lemma, I take it. Okay, so the kind of belief that I am going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about belief, kind of belief that I'm going to be talking about is the kind of belief you have in this sort of case. So if everybody looks, here we are, and I'm moving a thing along, and you might think, okay, that's red, that's moving, now it's rotating. Yeah. So you're forming, on the basis of a perceptual link, a body of beliefs that you would express using that. So that's the central case of what I'm going to call ordinary belief forming activity. Other kinds of case are cases where you form a body of beliefs in response to a testimony stream as opposed to a perceptual stream. And you would express that body of beliefs usually not using a demonstrative that, but using a proper name. So that's what I mean by ordinary belief forming activity. So now I'm on the handout. Ordinary belief forming activity is the activity of forming and maintaining the bodies of beliefs we express using ordinary singular terms. So some people, for example, your friend and mine, Francois Recanati, like to call these bodies of beliefs mental files. I engage in Puritan abstinence from use of the term mental file for reasons I'm happy to discuss afterwards. But So an ordinary belief-forming activity is the activity of forming and maintaining the bodies of beliefs we express using ordinary singular terms. Now, here's my lemma. Part of the aim, right? Part of the aim of ordinary belief-forming activity is to secure and maintain aboutness relations with particular things. So just let me add a definition of activity here, since I've used that term. A stream of behavior is an activity with partial aim X, if and only if it's guided by a personal level motivational state, part of whose goal is X. So I'm taking it that there's this connection between a stream of behavior being an activity and a stream of behavior being guided by a motivational state of you. A central case of a motivational state would be an intention. If I shut the door, what makes that an action of mine rather than just a reflex is that it was guided by my intention. And an activity is an I'm taking it, a motivationally guided stream of behavior that extends across time, that's longer than just an action. So here's the lemma, right? Here you are, forming beliefs that you'd express by saying that is red, that is rotating. The claim is what you're doing is an activity, and part of its aim is to secure and maintain aboutness relations with particular things. Now I intend that to be quite a feeble sounding little claim. I'm not saying the whole aim, just part of what you're trying to do is keep, as it were, a cognitive lock on the object. Sounds quite little and feeble, doesn't it? Right? But it's going to turn out that that feeble little claim, that's the thing that you have to resist if you want to resist like me and what I'm about to say. Because if you grant that claim, then you get a whole way really of thinking about how the mind locks onto the world and how thought and speech about the ordinary world work. Okay, so there's the lemma. So let me just mess around with this a little bit so that we can think about what the lemma says. One way to think about what it says is to think about what your view might be if you deny it. So here are three lemma denying views. And there are others, but here are three. So one thing you might do is you might say, look, we can tell just empirically that there's this kind of object structure there in ordinary cognition. You know, it shows up in all kinds of ways. So look, we've got singular terms that we use to ostensibly to talk about things. All these things that are known about the way short-term memory works, the way the visual system works, locking on to objects and bundling together information into object-shaped bundles, that kind of thing. Empirically, we know that it happens, right? But actually, that's not enough to get us the lemma, because it might be that these kind of object-shaped rubrics are simply shortcuts. So just think about Hilbert's program in the philosophy of mathematics. So Hilbert was fine with saying that there are finite numbers, but he really thought there was something wrong with transfinite numbers, right? Numbers you can't get to by starting with 0 and adding 1. Hilbert was just, oh, look, that doesn't really mean anything. Right? And so Hilbert said, look, we need to be using transfinite numbers because they're really useful, but talking about transfinite numbers is just taking a shortcut. It gets all of its legitimacy from the fact that all it does is give you a shorter pathway for a proof that you could construct without using the transfinite at all. And so you might think that what looks like object-centered cognition has that status. All it's doing is giving you a shortcut. The aim of ordinary belief-forming activity is not to secure aboutness. Rather, it's to maintain maybe a right map of how properties are distributed in the world. Now, we do treat various often encountered patterns in perception and testimony as involving contact with particular things, but this is a shortcut. What it does is radically increase the efficiency of our doing what the aim of ordinary cognition is to do, which is to get us a map of the world around us. Our objects are just kind of incidental. So it's one thing that you might say, and you'd be denying the lemma if you said that. Here's another thing that you might say. You might say, look, it's not that we've got this activity where securing and maintaining aboutness relations is part of the aim of the activity. Rather, ordinary belief formation is an activity, but aboutness is a precondition of this activity. So my dissertation advisor, John Campbell, thinks this. So the idea is that, say, in the perceptual demonstrative case, this case here, where you're thinking that is red, the aboutness fixing relation is perceptual attention to the object. Perceptual attention makes it the case that this thing here is the target of the information processing activity. And once you've done your target setting, the target setting relation enables you to engage in ordinary belief forming activity. And the activity's aim is to get right the properties of the attended object. But if you're not attending to an object in the first place, you're not genuinely engaged in ordinary belief forming activity at all. So you might say that, right? And that would be a second lemma denying view. Here's a third lemma denying view, and this comes out of the interpretationist tradition. So, you know, Quine and Davidson and Lewis. So you might say, look, a right account of the functional roles of mental states treats beliefs as, in general, rationalized by experience and rationalizing actions or activities given desires. So if that's my account of what a belief is, it's a mental state which is rationalized by experience and rationalizes action and activity given desires, then I'm not going to want to say that belief formation is itself an activity, because then I would get a horrid regress. Okay? So here are three kinds of things that you might say to deny this lemma of mine, right? And I want to reject all of those kinds of view and argue that formation is an activity, yeah. And secondly, it's an activity whose goal is partly to secure and maintain aboutness. So that'll get me an argument for the lemma. And then I want to show you how, if the lemma is granted, we get foundations for an account of aboutness in language and thought. So I'm going to try to do three things, really. Argue for the claim that there's an activity here. And so that'll be rejecting the interpretationist view and all views according to which it's inappropriate to talk about belief formation as an activity. I'm going to argue quite briefly against that sort of view. And then I'm going to spend quite a lot of time arguing that part of the goal is aboutness. Because most people who think belief formation is an activity and has a goal, I'm going to try to tell you that the goal is truth or knowledge. Right? And they're just not even thinking about the possibility that part of the goal is aboutness, which is what I'm going to argue. And then I'm going to use the claim that part of the goal is aboutness to show you how this framework for thinking about reference in language and thought that I've been developing can be set up. Okay, so now I'm at number 2 on the handout. Why think that there is an activity here at all? And there are a number of ways you might try to argue for this claim. Here's my current favorite, but I do keep shifting around on this, and I'll be interested to see whether other people have other views of how the argument, how an argument here should go. What I think I'm about to give you is what is right about quite a traditional line of argument, which is there in a famous paper by Bernard Williams and some other people. Other people have messed around with this as well. So people say, look, we can't just decide to believe. You can't just decide to believe something. Why not? Well, because part of what it is to believe is to believe or to form a mental state in a way that is in a way that is appropriately related to something that's pushing you along towards the state. And if that's right, then belief formation is rightly regarded as an activity. Okay, so here's my current view of what's right in this line of thought. So let's suppose for reductio, this is number 1 in this argument here now. Suppose that belief formation is not an activity. I'm assuming that for reductio. Now, a stream of behavior can be in intrinsic good order only if it is an activity. Why is that? Well, to say that a stream of behavior is in intrinsic good order is to say, look at what the agent is doing. The moves the agent is making can themselves count as in normative good order or not, aside from what's generated at the end of the stream. And I take that to be a mark of an activity. If you're assessing a stream of behavior for intrinsic good order in that way, then what you're assessing it for is aptness or appropriateness given its guiding motivational state. Okay, so if we say, supposing for reductio, that belief formation is not an activity, and we say a stream of behavior can be in intrinsic good order only if it is an activity, then we get number 3. There's no kind of normative good order that's intrinsic to a path to belief. That is, good order for paths to belief is derivative from good order for the results they tend to generate. So let me give you a silly thought experiment just to try to consolidate what's going on here. Suppose you find yourself in the following extremely unlikely situation. So just forgive me, right? Suppose you find yourself in a situation where your head has been cleared of ordinary beliefs about the world and ordinary routines for generating them. But you know that a belief is in good order only if it will plug into practical reasoning in such a way as to be a reliable generator of desire-fulfilling action. So you know that there's the standard of good order for beliefs, and you know that you can get yourself to adopt a belief-forming strategy just by choosing one and pushing a button that hypnotizes you into following it. So here you are, your head's been cleared of ordinary beliefs about the world, and it's been cleared of our ordinary routines for forming beliefs. And you're, God, I have to furnish my mind somehow. What shall I do? And so then you might embark on a project of trial and error. You might think, okay, I'm going to choose a method of belief formation. So suppose I'm just going to believe my eyes every 3rd time. Right? I'm going to choose a method of belief formation, and I'm going to go with this method for an interval. And then I'm going to assess whether the beliefs are in good order. If I come back and the beliefs I formed by this method were not in good order, by my standard, there at number B, then I'm going to try again. I'm going to try a different method. And in this way, by trial and error, I'll get myself in a situation where I'm forming beliefs by an appropriate method. Okay? So if what we have at number 3 is right, that there's no normative good order intrinsic to a path to belief, good order for paths to belief is derivative from good order for the results they tend to generate, there should be nothing incoherent about that. Yeah, but this idea that you can about the situation as described, but there is something incoherent about that, right? There is normative good order that's intrinsic to paths to belief. So ordinary belief formation is an activity. A path to belief is an intrinsic good order if and only if it is apt to the guiding motivational state of this activity. Okay, so that's what I take to be right about this traditional line of thought, that there's something wrong with the claim that you can't just decide to believe. So I've turned that into the claim that you can't just have trial and error with respect to belief forming methods and then assess them for whether, assess belief forming methods just by taking the results and asking if the results that are generated are in good order. Okay, so suppose we grant that belief formation is an activity. Okay, so if you weren't listening or didn't follow, then it's okay, because you can just jump back in right here, right? Suppose we grant that ordinary belief formation is an activity. What's the goal of the activity? And usual answers, as I said, to this question are that belief formation aims at truth, or belief formation aims at knowledge, things like that. And just notice, those are whole proposition-sized claims. Saying belief formation aims at truth, and that's something that we assess for the whole belief content, or belief formation aims at knowledge. So if we just went all the way there to look, it's aiming at truth or it's aiming at knowledge, then we're just missing out the thing that I want to argue, which is that part of the goal is aboutness. Okay, so why should we think this, that part of the goal is aboutness? And again, there are other arguments here, but here are two arguments, and they're both concern cases of aboutness failure or emptiness. And if you just think about this, I have a current self-righteous view concerning what people call the problem of empty names, yeah, which is that the problem of empty names, it has been, for 100 years, this thing where people say, oh look, here's my view of names, and oh look, it solves the problem of empty names. Yeah, so you stick the problem, you say, oh, look, it solves the problem of empty names. And you stick that on at the end as a sort of showcase for something that your view can do. And but if we're thinking of ordinary belief-forming activity, including the formation of the beliefs that we express using our ordinary proper names, if we are taking this activity-focused view of how to understand what's going on, well, part of how you should be thinking, if you're thinking what's the nature of an activity, or part of what you're going to do if you're thinking what's the nature of an activity, is look at cases where attempts at the activity fail, or look at cases where somebody's just pretending to engage in the activity, and you should expect those cases to be highly probative, right, with respect to your account of what the activity actually is. So it might seem a bit weird if I say, what's the goal of the activity? Then to say, okay, let me look at what I'm going to look at is a case of what I call accidental emptiness, or cases of what I call accidental emptiness. That's where you're basically trying to do things as usual, but you fail, on the one hand, and cases of pretense, cases of names in fiction are on the other. But actually, if ordinary belief formation is to be understood as an activity, we should expect these cases, accidental failure cases and pretense cases, to tell us quite a lot about how this activity should be understood. Okay, so I'm going to give two arguments which are going to generate the answer that I want to this question: what's the goal of the activity? So here's the first argument. I call this the accidental emptiness argument. So here are two cases. So the first case, so this is a that thought based on a perceptual link with a non-object. Suppose you're having an experience indistinguishable by you from an experience of a rectangular thing in the middle distance. You've got no reason not to take things at face value, so no reason not to be just following along with perception. You form the belief you would express by saying that is rectangular. In fact, your experience as of something rectangular is caused by a freak combination of a speck on your glasses, a far-off tree, and a building on the horizon. That's one case, accidental emptiness involving a demonstrative. Here's another case, and this is a real case. It's this named David Agnew. Now, in the 1970s, so this is when Britain still had a labour movement. In the 1970s, BBC regulations forbade assignment of a script writing credit to anyone other than a show's initial script writers. So a last-minute change by someone outside this group could not be credited to the person who made it. Instead, the fact that such a change had been made would be indicated by adding this name, David Agnew, which was a name introduced for the purpose, to the credits, regardless of the fact that many different people made such last-minute contributions. So you see the name David Agnew appear repeatedly in BBC credits from this era, and you're ignorant of the story behind the name. You end up with a range of beliefs that you would express by saying things like, David Agnew could turn his hand to either comedy or drama. I don't know how versatile he was. You think he worked on nature programs in 1976 and 78. He worked in children's TV in 1975. Okay, so here are two claims. Here's a claim about these cases. It's a conjunction, right? And I intend this to apply to both cases. In each case, there's an attempt at ordinary belief-forming activity. So the idea is that whatever it is that you're in fact successfully doing in this case, where you think, that's red, that's moving, you are attempting to do in case number one. And whatever it is that you successfully do in a case where I introduce a genuine proper name to you and start telling you a story about this person, you are trying to do it in case number two. So in each case, there's an attempt at ordinary belief-forming activity, and this attempt fails with respect to the goal of the activity. Okay, so let's take that claim. Now here's an argument. First premise, and this is the first conjunct of the claim that I got out of the examples. The aboutness of the resulting beliefs is not required for attempts at ordinary belief formation. So it doesn't have to be aboutness in order for you to be making an attempt. But the aboutness of the resulting beliefs is required for successful attempts at ordinary belief formation. Now here's a general claim. If generation of X is required for success at an activity, but is not required for a mere attempt, then generation of result X is part of the goal of the activity. So the aboutness of the resulting beliefs is part of the goal of ordinary belief formation. Okay, now obviously, so that argument's valid. 1 and 2 were that's just separating out what we said about the examples. So everything here depends on whether number 3 should be accepted. Okay, but I could take up all the rest of the time talking about number 3. So at the moment, I'm just going to leave it as something we can talk about if we like. And it's not implausible, right? The generation of X is a requirement for success, but it's not a requirement for an attempt. So it's not just part of the background conditions for engaging in the activity. It's a requirement for success. It's not there in the background conditions for making an attempt. The suggestion is that makes it part of the goal. Okay, here's a second argument for this claim that I'm after. So remember, the claim that I'm after is that aboutness relations to objects are part of the goal of ordinary belief formation. So here is a second attempt to argue for this claim. So again, if you're feeling a bit dozy, now's a good time to jump back in because it's a new argument. Okay, so here's the argument. And so I'm going to be thinking about standard fictions. You know, sometimes when people are talking about fiction, people get all excited about cases of fiction where, you know, it's part of the thing that you've got to accept contradiction. Okay, so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about straight narrative. Yeah, like I promessi sposi or something like that. Yeah, so a straight narrative where you're reading along and you're basically pretending the world is real. They're pretending that that the events are taking place. That's what I'm calling a standard fiction. Okay. I suggest, and we can talk about this later if people want to, engagement with standard fictions is genuine pretense of uptake from testimony. Yeah. What do I mean by genuine pretense? Well, when a subject genuinely pretends to do something, say A, the subject's actions are generated by the guidance mechanism that generates the subject's real-world A-ings running within the scope of a pretense. So just think about the idea of a practice trial. So in law schools in New Zealand, this is called a moot court, M-O-O-T, right? Where what you're doing is taking a case and running it with all of the rules for running a trial in place, so that the little people who are going to grow up to be lawyers can be practicing the thing. Yeah, this is genuine pretense. Yeah, what you do is you're acting in ways that are generated by the guidance mechanism that generates real world actions, but within the scope of a pretense. Okay, where in the practice trial case, that within the scope of the pretense is, well, okay, the outcome is not going to matter for anybody's life. And, you know, okay, we take our facts from this sheet of stipulations, and we don't regard the sheet of stipulations as potentially itself up for question or anything like that. That's part of what it is for the whole thing to be running within the scope of a pretense. There's a contrast between genuine pretense and simulation. Okay, so what I'm going to call simulation, or running a, so think about running a practice trial and running what in English is called a kangaroo court, where the whole thing is just being run to let it be seen that there is a trial. There's all kinds of filth and corruption determining how the proceedings actually go, and the outcome is predetermined. It's not a genuine trial at all. It's just being made to look like one. Right? So there's a distinction between genuinely pretending and simulating in that sense. And the suggestion is that engagement with standard fictions, what happens when you are reading a standard fiction, and you are and cognition is doing its thing. Engagement with standard fiction is genuine pretense of uptake from testimony. Right? Okay, now this activity, the activity of engagement with a standard fiction, it involves what I'm going to call internal commitment to the reality of what is described. So what happens, you're reading the fiction and you don't take it that the only sort of facts in the story are the ones that are explicitly written down. You fill in gaps and you draw conclusions and so on. This is what I'm calling narrative construction. And the idea is that this activity, this is number 2 now, this activity involves internal commitment to the reality of what is described. In building the narrative the way you do, you are, within the scope of the pretense, treating it as a narrative that describes real events and characters and places, right? But this narrative constructing activity also involves recognizing that at many points, there's no fact of the matter as to what the world of the fiction is like. But now we've got a tension between number 2 and number 3. So number 2 says that you're treating this narrative that you're building as a narrative that does describe real events and characters and places. Number 3 says it also involves recognizing that at many points there's just no fact of the matter as to what the world of the fiction is like. There's a tension between these two things whose resolution, I suggest, demands that we accept number 4. The internal commitment to reality involved in engagement with a standard fiction is commitment within the scope of pretense to using the text to secure and sustain aboutness relations with individuals, individual people and places and things and events. But now, given the definition of genuine pretense, we can move to number 5. Part of the aim of ordinary uptake from testimony is to secure and sustain aboutness relations with individuals. Where did that move come from? Well, if engagement with standard fiction is pretending is genuine pretense of uptake from testimony, then engagement with standard fiction is letting the guidance system of uptake from testimony run within the scope of a genuine pretense. And so now we can take from the structure that we see in the fictional case, we can conclude that, okay, that same structure is there in the real case, which is number 5. Okay, so there are various elements in this argument from fiction that need more support. Let's talk about number 2. So number 2 says, look, the activity in which you're engaged, it involves internal commitment to the reality of what is described. Okay, so the contrast is with the suggestion that you engage in your activity, you build your little story, and you add, oh, I'll pretend it's real on at the end. So the suggestion is this is not what is happening. In engaging in the narrative construction the way you do, you are already pretending that it's real. That's why the narrative construction proceeds the way it does. Because that's a bit more in defense of number 2. What about number 4? Right, so I take it that people are going to grant number 3. Right? So many points, there's just no fact of the matter. Right? So the tension was that you are engaging in a genuine pretense of reality, while at the same time acknowledging that there are holes all over the place. How can you really be pretending that how can you really be pretending that you are building up a picture of a real world at the same time as acknowledging that at all kinds of points there are just no facts of the matter as to what that world is like? And the solution is you're not building up a picture of a real world. Yeah, you're building up an account of this character and this character and this character and this train of events. And the real world, you do the filling in only when it's required and only when you feel like it. Right? So see that this objects first, build up a picture of objects first, is providing a solution to the tension that we found. Okay, so here's what I think I've done. I've argued for this lemma in two stages. Firstly, I argued for the claim that ordinary belief forming activity, ordinary belief formation is rightly construed as an activity. So when you see the thing moving along and you think that is red, that is rotating, there's an activity of ordinary belief formation. And I've argued that part of the goal of this activity is to achieve a representation of an object, right? Aboutness relations with objects. Okay, but I haven't yet said anything about what an aboutness relation actually is, except that it's an aboutness relation, right? What I'm now going to do is take the lemma, the claim that ordinary belief formation is an activity partly directed at securing aboutness relations, and use it to argue for foundations for an account of aboutness in language and thought. Okay, so these are the thing that I'm going to present. This is my current view of the best argument for the central part of my framework, which is the thing Alberto was talking about, that aboutness is cognitive focus. Okay, so if you just think, so again, if you were asleep, you could jump back on here and still get something out of the talk. Hurrah! Yeah. Okay, so just think about the traditional aboutness literature through the 20th century, the traditional debate. How did it go? Well, it kind of went, look, in the beginning there were Frege and Russell, and those guys were basically descriptivists. So they thought, here's what happens. I grasp a description, and then what makes it the case that my thought is about the object out there in the world is that I've got this descriptive condition in mind and the object satisfies it. And then the various attempts to make descriptivism work, and then there was Kripke. Yeah? And Kripke said, no, look, you can't be a descriptivist for all of these reasons. And then there were various people trying to have hybrid views. So Kripke said, look, it's all about a causal connection. And then there were people saying, no, look, it's got to be causalist and descriptivist. Then we had to and fro and then in the 1980s, I guess, people just stopped talking about this. Yeah. Did they stop talking about it because the problem was solved? No, people stopped talking about it because the problem became unfashionable. You know, one reason it became unfashionable is just people have tried this and tried that, and you had these examples and counterexamples and you know, whatever. Some people convinced themselves that one kind of view would work, but everybody else thought there were counterexamples to that view, and people started talking about other stuff. Okay, now. What I've been suggesting for a little while now is that when you've got a whole lot of philosophical ink and activity devoted towards a question like this, in this case, the question, what makes it the case that my thoughts are about an object out there in the world, and you haven't got progress towards agreement, you've got some agreement about what doesn't work. You haven't got progress towards what does work. This is a sign that we need to reset the debate. And so what I suggest is that we go back to first principles concerning this debate about aboutness. Yeah? And here are two first principles. So one, this is under number 4 on the handout now. One principle connects truth and justification. It says justification is truth conducive. If your belief is justified, you'll be unlucky if it's not true. That's one principle. Here's another principle connecting aboutness and truth. If you've got a belief, say alpha is phi, yeah, this is red. The belief is that belief is true if and only if the object it's about has the relevant property. Those principles sound pretty good, right? Principle connecting truth and justification, principle connecting aboutness and truth. But okay, so think about what we've got now. We've got an aboutness and truth principle and a truth and justification principle. It's going to be very surprising and sad if we can't cut the intermediate term and find a principle connecting aboutness and justification. And that is going to be a principle which brings out the significance for accounts of aboutness of the fact that justification is truth conducive. Now, here's the principle that I propose, and I'll call it here aboutness and justification. Body of beliefs, what Francois would call a mental file. A body of beliefs is about an object O, if and only if O is the unique object whose properties the subject will be unlucky to get wrong in justifying the beliefs the way she does. So that is, if and only if the means of justification associated with the body of beliefs converges on the object. And here's an analogy to bring out what that principle says. The fact that a telescope is focused on object O. Imagine you've got your telescope, it's focused on an object, and you're writing down the data that you get through the telescope, okay? Does the fact that your telescope is focused on the object guarantee that the data you get, the report you write, is going to match what the object is like? Well, no, right? But it does guarantee something, which is that the data the telescope delivers will match the object unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. So that is ordinary focus, say focus for a telescope. And I suggest that the aboutness of our ordinary beliefs is cognitive focus. So here I am forming my beliefs. So here you are forming your beliefs. That's red, that's moving, now it's rotating. Yeah. Your beliefs are about the object in virtue of your perceptual link with the object. But how does your perceptual link put you in a position to form beliefs about the object? Well, not by giving you a fail-safe way of getting the object's properties right. Yeah. There could be all kinds of things going wrong so that you end up with beliefs that don't match what the object is like. The suggestion rather is that your perceptual link secures aboutness by making available a means of justification such that beliefs justified by this means will match what the object is like unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. So you see, that's not a descriptivist view, because you could be getting it all wrong. And it's not a causalist view, because what's doing the work is this securing of justification that converges on the object. But what we do have is a way of explaining how it is that a causal relation to an object, for example, a perceptual relation, does aboutness fixing work when it does, namely by securing cognitive focus. Okay, so that's the framework that I have. And the framework is built around this biconditional. Right? Biconditional says aboutness if and only if cognitive focus. So what I've done is attempt to seduce you into accepting my biconditional by cheating and saying something that sounds like the cut rule. Yeah. So I said, look, aboutness and truth and justification. Oh, look, of course you can cut the intermediate term and get an aboutness and justification principle, can't you? Yeah, that's cheating. Yeah. And then I also gave you an analogy. So it's like a telescope. So hopefully this makes the thing look kind of plausible, but we want an argument. Right now, how do you prove a biconditional? The biconditional is P if and only if Q. You want to prove if P then Q and prove if Q then P. So that's what I'm going to do. The proof of one direction of the biconditional is going to use my lemma, and then we're going to be done. Right. So just hang on. This is the last phase. Okay. So the biconditional that I want to prove says aboutness if and only if cognitive focus. Now this biconditional has got an easy direction and a hard direction. Let's do the easy direction first. The easy direction says if there's aboutness, then there is cognitive focus. This is 4.1 on the handout. Okay, so let's start. We're going to assume aboutness and derive cognitive focus. Okay, so let's suppose that subject S's belief that alpha is phi is about object O. Right? Okay, now here's the aboutness and truth principle. And alpha is phi belief is true if and only if the object it's about is phi. That's the, everyone with me? Okay, so now let's combine 1 and 2, and we get S's belief that alpha is phi is true if and only if O is phi. Now let's add the truth and justification principle. If S's belief that alpha is phi is justified, S will be unlucky if it's not true. And now we feed the right-hand side of number 3, which was the conditions for the truth of the belief, O is phi, plug that into the unlucky if it's not true part of number 4, and we get 5. If S's belief that alpha is phi is justified, S will be unlucky if O is not phi. Okay? And our choice of phi was arbitrary, so we're getting this across all the properties. If your belief is justified, then you're going to be unlucky if it doesn't match what the object is like, which is to say, it's going to match what the object is like unless a spoiler intervenes. Okay, so there's the, if there's aboutness, then there's cognitive focus direction of the biconditional. And I suggest that even if you didn't like anything else that I say today, you should accept that, right, as a necessary condition on aboutness. If your belief is justified, you'll be unlucky if the object is not phi, which just generalizes into if there's aboutness, there is cognitive focus. Okay, so what about the other way around? Right? And I have been messing around with looking for a good argument for this other direction of the biconditional for a while. And part of where the earlier part of the talk about the activity and the lemma, but really where that's coming from is that I've been looking for the real argument for the claim that where there's cognitive focus, there is aboutness. And I think I've now found it. And the claim that ordinary belief formation is an activity partly directed at securing aboutness plays, as we're going to see, a crucial role. Okay, so let's see how this works. This is number 4.2. So let's suppose for reductio. Right. I know that there've been a lot of arguments. See, I myself like arguments in a talk. Been a lot of arguments. This is the last one. Okay, last one. Suppose that it's not sufficient for subject's alpha belief, by which I mean the beliefs that you'd express using a demonstrative, or the beliefs you'd express using a proper name. Suppose that it's not sufficient for these beliefs to be about an object, that the associated pattern of justification converge on the object. So what we're doing is supposing that cognitive focus is not sufficient for aboutness. Everyone on board? Okay, now, if that's right, if cognitive focus is not sufficient for aboutness, then there could be a situation in which you've got cognitive focus, but you haven't got aboutness, right? Which is to say that this combination here would be coherent, right? So the following combination is coherent. This is the top of page 4 of the handout now. The subject S has a body, and let's say they're that beliefs the subject's expressing using a demonstrative. The subject has a body of justified, that is 5 beliefs. There's no spoiler interfering with any of the property detection aspects of the path to these beliefs. And there is an object upon whose fineness or not the subject's phi detecting procedures are non-luckily picking up. Nevertheless, the beliefs are not about the object, because cognitive focus is not enough for aboutness, right? Okay, now, in this scenario we've just described, the circumstance is either rationally relevant to the belief-forming activity, or it's not. Right? We've introduced this term that I now want to define, rational relevance. The rationally relevant circumstances for an activity are those across which, right? So the rationally relevant circumstances for belief-forming activity are those across which justification, which is just exercise of belief-forming competence, guarantees success. So the idea is, here you are forming your beliefs. What's required for justification? Well, that your belief-forming method, or what you do, be good enough that you're going to succeed unless you're unlucky. Right? But when we say you're going to succeed unless you're unlucky, really what we're doing is saying some of the ways for you to fail are relevant to assessment of good order for your belief-forming activity. So your belief-forming activity has to guard against those failure possibilities, but there are also these irrelevant ways that you might fail, ways that are maybe so unusual that it's not a requirement of exercise of belief-forming competence that you rule out those ways for things to go wrong. So the relevant non-success circumstances are the ones you do have to guard against, right? And the irrelevant ones are the ones you don't. If you're in an irrelevant circumstance, then you might be competent but still fail, in which case you're unlucky. If you're in a relevant circumstance and you're competent, you will succeed. Competence guarantees success across relevant circumstances. Okay? So what I'm doing is kind of squashing together stuff about good order for practical assessment of actions, and stuff about good order for belief formation. You should sort of expect that, given what I said before. Okay, so let's go back to number 2. So we've described this circumstance, and we've said, look, in this scenario, either S's circumstance is rationally relevant to belief-forming activity, or it is not. Right? Now we're going to prove you can't have either, and we'll be done. Right? Okay, the circumstance is not rationally relevant. It's not one where competence guarantees success. This is number 3. Why not? Well, 3.1, the circumstance involves exercise of whatever competence we exercise when we form that as phi beliefs. Because think about what you're doing. You're sitting here, you are forming beliefs in a way which does succeed in tracking what an object out there in the world is like. Yeah. And, what more can there be to exercise of the competence we're exercising when we form that beliefs than that? Okay, now suppose the lemma, part of what we're aiming for in managing information as we do when we form our that beliefs is to secure and maintain aboutness relations. Okay, then, in the circumstance that we've described back when we said this combination is coherent, the subject is forming her that beliefs competently, but the aim of belief formation is not achieved, in which case the circumstance is outside the range across which competence guarantees success, so it's not relevant. So we said either it's relevant or it's not. It's not relevant. Okay, so maybe it's irrelevant. Number 4. Well, it's not irrelevant. Why not? Okay, so 4.1, just note the circumstance is not irrelevant with respect to formation of the corresponding something as phi belief. In the circumstance that we're describing, there'd be nothing lucky about the subject getting it right that something is phi. Why not? Well, in the circumstance, nothing is interfering with the subject's exercise of phi detecting competence. But given that the circumstance is not irrelevant with respect to the something is phi belief, if we say that it is irrelevant with respect to the that is phi belief, we're allowing that a circumstance irrelevant with respect to formation of the belief that that is phi might be relevant with respect to formation of the belief that something is phi. And this cannot be. Let's just see why not. Would be allowing that you might be justified in believing that is square by a path which would not justify you in believing something is square. Okay. Why is that? Well, a path to belief secures justification only if it rules out every relevant belief not true circumstance. You might still be wrong, but if you're actually justified, you've got to be unluckily wrong, right? Which is to say the circumstance has to be irrelevant. So if a path to belief secures justification, it's got to eliminate every relevant belief not true circumstance. But if a circumstance that's irrelevant with respect to believing that is square can be relevant with respect to believing something is square, you might have this condition met with respect to believing that is square, but not with respect to believing something is square. So justification that secures the rationality of believing that is square might fail to justify you in believing something is square. Okay, so here's what we did. We said if it's, suppose that cognitive focus is not enough for aboutness. If cognitive focus is not enough for aboutness, then this scenario here is coherent. If that scenario is coherent, we've got to say, with respect to the circumstance, either it's relevant, rationally relevant, or it's not. We've shown that it can't be either. So we can reject the initial assumption for reductio and conclude that if there's cognitive focus, there is a boundness. And that's the argument for the other direction of the biconditional. Okay, I should stop. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Imogen, for this very rich and stimulating talk. Now it's time for the Q&A session. As anybody should already know, if you want to ask questions, just write question or Q in the chat, and I will list the order of the people asked. Yes, Fabrizio first.
So thank you very much. I'm not an expert at all, so I just have very, very naive question. So in many parts of the talk, you model aboutness relation as perceptual tracking relations, and also, so for instance, seeing and tracking a red pen on similar, and also the notion of cognitive focus. Well, brings someone to think that aboutness relations are just perceptual relation. But indeed, I assume that perceptual relation are just one example, one class of aboutness relation. Is this right?
Yes, that is right.
Okay, so
yes.
that's
Did you have more, or shall I say a little bit more to explain?
No, well, that's if you can say a little bit more. Indeed, that it's better for just for my clarification. So,
so the other relations that I've said things about so far, not in this talk but elsewhere, are relations made available by your grasp of a proper name. Yeah, and so that's meant to be like the perceptual case, but instead of you having a link with the object, so that you've got a signal coming from the object, and then you form a body of beliefs which is about the object on the basis of the signal, which is perceptual. In an ordinary understanding of proper names case, say it's a case where I introduce a new name. So say Ekatahuna. Anyone heard of that before? No, this is a small place. Maybe I'll put as Peter. Small place in the North Island of New Zealand. Yeah? So I introduce a name that's new to you. Then I start telling you about it. The idea is you've got a testimony stream instead of a perceptual stream. Then you do something cognitive and you end up with a body of beliefs. And the question is, what makes those beliefs about the object? And the answer is, again, well, given the situation, you've got a means of justification which converges on the object. So you've got cognitive focus. And then the other case is the case of descriptive names. Right? So there's this famous descriptive name. Gareth Evans, The Varieties of Reference, introduces this descriptive name, Julius. Yep. So Julius is the inventor of the zip. Okay. So suppose we're back at the time of the introduction of the name. Yeah. I say, look, let's use Julius as the name of the inventor of the zip. And then I say to you, but might Julius not have invented the zip? What's the answer probably going to be? Well, Evans thought no, right? Because if I introduce the name using a descriptive stipulation like that, then if there is an inventor of the zip, it's Julius. Yeah. But now suppose that we're trying to find out who Julius was. You know, all the Americans think that the zip was invented in America. Apparently, actually, it's Swedish or something. But you know, we're trying to find out who Julius was, and you know, we all this investigation, we rule out the American hypothesis because we find out that you know, there were zips in Europe at a time before anybody could conceivably have invented such a thing in America. Here we are, we're trying to home in on where we home in on the Nordic countries. Yeah, right. Then we find out that zips were discovered just like growing in the forest in Norway. Where, okay, look, Julius found zips, and then like pretended that he'd invented this thing when he just found it. Okay, so it can turn out. Now, so in that case, has it turned out that there is no Julius? And if Evans was right, the answer is going to be yes, because there is no inventor of the zip. But I think that's a wrong answer. You've got this description of the inventor of the zip. What were we doing with the description when we were trying to find out who Julius was? We were using the description to try to justify beliefs, Julius's F beliefs. And even though there's not a satisfier of the description, right, there is an object such that by using the description to harvest information and try to build up a picture, we are cognitively focused on the object. We're going to end up with beliefs that match the object unless some unlucky spoiler intervenes. So I get that for descriptive names, the description plays a role in securing aboutness, but the thing that the beliefs are about might not be the satisfier of the description. You see? But it's supposed to be the same mechanism that's securing aboutness in all three of these cases, the perceptual demonstrative case, the case of your understanding of an ordinary proper name, and then this case of descriptive names.
Thank you very much. Good.
The second question is by Julia.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have another clarificatory question. I guess it's connected somehow about the relation between the lemma you defend and the precondition view.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with something like Campbell's view. I was wondering whether you would be happy with something like this view. So there's some cases where like the one that you were talking about with Fabrizio, where perception doesn't seem to play much of a role in allowing us to get aboutness. But let's focus on the perceptual cases. So maybe in the perceptual cases, the reason why or let's put it this way, maybe in the perceptual cases, we could say an ordinary belief forming activity involves perceptually attending to particulars. So it's part of how we go about ordinarily forming beliefs in those cases that we attend to particulars. So if you look at things that way, that I'm not sure whether there really is an incompatibility with the precondition view as restricted to these perceptual cases. I mean, I guess you could put it this way. I mean, it is an alternative to the precondition view, but it's not that perceptual attention isn't doing some key work in securing aboutness. It's that it's just part of the process, if it makes sense.
Yeah, good. Okay, so Campbell's view that I've mentioned and that Julia's talking about. So it's the view that the way that a perceptual attentional link puts you in a position to think about an object is by securing the status of the object as the target of the information processing. Right? So what's attention, or if you've got something happening in peripheral vision, are you seeing it? Some people get all excited about that. I'm quite happy to say that you're seeing it, but this is not an attentional perceptual link. And Campbell really had the first bigger exploration of the fact that in order to secure demonstrative reference, a perceptual link has to be attentional. And his explanation was that in the peripheral vision case, though you are receiving information from the object and so on, there is no target setting. Okay. So if that's your view, then you're going to say, as he does, perceptual attention is a precondition for thought about objects, because if there's no perceptual attention, then there's no target setting. And if there's no target setting, then the kind of information processing that generates thought about objects is just not up and running. So this is the precondition thing. And so so Julia, it's right that the preconditioned view, I think it only looks plausible for the perceptual case. Yeah. So this is something we're agreeing about. It doesn't look plausible for the case where there is a you come across a proper name, right, and you start using the proper name, because the suggestion would have to be that if there's no object that's the referent, the activity that you're engaged, the activity is in fact not an activity of the same kind as it is in the case where there is a referent. And that looks very implausible for the case of proper names. Yeah. So if we just focus on the perceptual view, you might think, look, it's open to me to say that in the other cases, the kind of thing that I want is working, but why not go along with Campbell and say that if you're not actually perceptually attending, it's not the same kind of activity, which is what's generating this preconditioned view. So what he ends up with, Campbell, so say with respect to the first of the accidental aboutness failure cases I had. So that's the case where you're having an experience indistinguishable by you from an experience of a rectangular thing, but actually there's a speck on your glasses, a tree in the middle distance, and the tail of a dog or something, and there's not any ordinary object there at all. Now there is what vision scientists would call a visual object, but a visual object, you've got a lock on a visual object just when your perceptual feed has this kind of object coherence, so that you can keep doing what someone like Zenon Polishin would call, you can keep doing object attention, right? So if we go with Campbell and we allow ourselves to be charmed by his accent and so on, and we say, oh yes, right, there's if there's not an attentional lock on the object, it's a different kind of activity, so perceptual attention is a precondition. We say that, then we have to say either that the successful reference in a case like my case one, so a lock on a visual object, suffices for aboutness, or we have to say, if the visual object is not a potential object of demonstrative thought, then the activity is different. And there's no basis for that claim that there's a different activity. Yeah. Now, if it's hallucination, so you haven't got a visual object at all, then it makes sense to say that it's a different activity, or it's failure to engage in the activity. Yeah. But what Campbell locks himself into, what this preconditioned view locks you into, is the claim that having an attentional lock on the object, or having an attentional lock, or exercising object attention with respect to the mind-independent world, yeah, goes hand in hand with securing aboutness. So that whenever you can attend, there's an object that you could think about, right? And Campbell actually, he flips backwards and forwards between, so say something like a ripple. Is it a thing? Yeah. He doesn't make up his mind. He does not want that to be a thing, but his view compels him to say that if it's not a thing there for you to refer to and think about, then this is not really attention. And you can't say that because it's a visual object, the little reflection on top of the water or something. So he doesn't have a stable view at this point. So that's where I'm pushing back against this idea that you could say that it's a precondition.
So what is dissatisfactory for you, where campus accountability is satisfactory, is it doesn't allow us to say that in your example one, there is an unsuccessful attempt of the same kind of activity. Is that the idea?
He's going to have to say this is not an attempt.
Yeah, whereas you want it to be an unsuccessful attempt of the same kind.
That's right. And then I also think that, so I used to think that, so I used to go the old Strawson way, right? And say, look, there are these classes of belief about particulars in the world. Imagine Strawson sitting back and declaring this. Yeah, there's classes of belief about ordinary objects, the ones made available by perception, ones made available by grasp of a proper name, and then ones made available by grasp of a description. Yeah, and these we can treat them separately. Now, if you take that view, then there's a certain, then this idea that you could carve off the perceptual demonstrative ones and say, well, look, for them, there's a precondition. About the aboutness fixing relation is a precondition, but for the others, it's not, for engagement in the activity. But I now think that really, I think because of things people said to me about my first book, I think, well, look, actually, you can't claim that there's this divide between three cases, between the three kinds of case, and that they're distinct in this kind of way. Because I had said, look, you can have hybrid cases and mixed cases, but I'm not going to talk about them. But actually, most cases are mixed. Yeah, most of the time you're looking at something, and then you've got grasp of a proper name. You think it's the thing in the distance. Or I have grasp of a proper name, and then I'm thinking, oh, look, there she is, and I'm adding things in. And so most ordinary cognition involves a combination of these kinds of strategy. Right? You take steps, you deploy a description, testimony is doing the work, perception is doing the work, and any individual path to ordinary belief formation is quite likely to involve steps of these different kinds. And so if we then try to say, oh, look, aboutness is a precondition for engagement in the activity in the perceptual demonstrative case, but not in these other cases, we just get a big mess, I now think. So there are two, at the moment, there are two moves I'm making against the precondition view. One is, look, it doesn't give you a right account of these cases that just are failed attempts, right? And the other is that this is one of the respects in which we should be looking for uniformity across all ordinary aboutness, and the precondition view, if it works, would work only for the perceptual case.
Can I just make one small comment? Thanks. Yeah, I think I understand it better, and I'm sympathetic with the idea that we need some sort of a general unified account. Is it correct to say that even if you go for your general proposal, it may still be that ordinary belief forming activity can look very different case by case? So yeah, to an extent, you can incorporate some elements of what Campbell says about the importance of, say, perceptual attention for certain cases, in that it might be that in some cases, belief forming activity involves deploying perceptual attention, even if there is something in common that is much more abstract across cases, which is that in part they have as a goal aboutness with respect to particulars. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, there's so I really have not yet, I haven't really made up my mind exactly what to say here. So I used to think, look, I want to be talking about means of belief formation. And you know the old objection to reliabilism about S knows that P epistemology. Right? The objection, okay, so reliabilist says belief is justified if it's formed by a reliable method. Then everyone's okay, what's a method? If you don't answer that question, then I can make any true belief, or I can make any means of belief formation come up reliable, and your view collapses. So you've got to tell me what a method is. So it's old epistemology literature. And so I had been saying, look, take a belief, and this is still because it's something I had been saying, and what you're seeing is material in flux, as it were, right? A bit. It's still kind of there. I had been saying, look, when is the belief that you express using a singular term about an object? Well, your uses of a singular term are associated with a belief forming method. And the beliefs are about the object if and only if that method is such that if it justifies beliefs, you'll be unlucky if the object doesn't match those beliefs. Right? So I had this business about what's a belief forming method? Just like I was just dealing with it. And I used to say to people would say, what's a method? And I'd say, oh, that's a problem for everybody. You got to have something to say. And but I actually think now, because of this kind of issue about, oh, look, when is perceptual stuff when is it perception, when's it testimony, when's it using a description to harvest information, mixed cases, all of this stuff. What I now want to do is say something like, look, you've got a particular token path to belief formation. And instead of trying to gloss my notion of focus in terms of a method of justification, which will tend to get the object's properties right, which gives me all those old reliabilist problems, I'm going to say, here's your token path to belief, which involves this kind of step, so maybe a perceptual step, testimony step, description-based step. It involves all these different steps. Okay, now this notion of safety that I want, safety with respect to matching the object, is going to be in terms of what this method would and would not deliver. Sorry, what this token path, what paths similar to this token path would and would not deliver in nearby situations. Yeah, so some kind of notion of safety like that. But the perceptual part, right, is always going to be perceptual attentional. So I think Campbell was just right that where a perceptual link is securing, on the one hand, aboutness, and on the other hand, justification for the beliefs, it's an attentional perceptual link. So perceptual attention is still going to be right in there, because wherever a step in one of these token pathways, and there still will be pure perceptual cases, yeah? There's still pure perceptual cases. So in a pure perceptual case, that's just you're perceptually attending to the object, and then my story runs. And then in these other cases, you've got a perceptual step or a perceptual strand in the token path to belief formation, and there's got to be attentional in this picture.
Thank you, Julia. There is another question by Matteo.
So, thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a pedantic question and a stupid question, and both have to do with the argument for the dilemma. That is the main character of your talk. And well, the first pedantic question is, it's more of unsolicited advice. So I think you could just present the argument as a as a regular instance of modus ponens. So if you simply say there is normative good order that is intrinsic to paths to belief, that's premise 1, and premise 2 is if stream of behavior can be in intrinsic good order, then it is an activity. Then you should get the conclusion that ordinary belief formation is an activity. So I think maybe then, given that anyway you maybe should move the refutation of 3. Okay, you can rephrase the refutation of 3 as an argument in favor of 4. I mean, it's just a matter of presentation. That's why I say that it is pedantic.
Okay, I think thank you. I think you're just right about that. Actually, this is the first time I've said this argument out in public. Yeah, and I think you're right that given what's doing the work, yeah, you're just right about that. It doesn't. That's a better presentation of it.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I suppose
it's still valid. I mean, your
yeah,
argument is valid.
that's right. But you're just right that there's a more streamlined, version. So I'm good. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I'm a very simple-minded person, so given that there might be others.
I mean, so I guess that something I lose by doing that. But see, I don't know. Like Alberto, do you think this old, that Bernard Williams paper, deciding to believe, and so this is there's this old literature which says you can't decide to believe, right? And so I'm trying to acknowledge the fact that that literature is just over my shoulder, and then what I'm kind of trying to bring out is the is the debt to that literature. But I think I'll think about it, but I suspect I'll just end up going in the direction that Matteo is recommending with respect to presentation of that. Yeah.
Okay. And here comes the stupid question. So would you say that sleeping is an activity?
That sleeping is an activity.
Yeah. I would say no, but
yeah, I also would say no.
Okay, because here is why I'm asking you this question, because I think that sleeping can be in intrinsic good order, and so I think there is a good way to. So I used to sleep very well when I was younger, and now I'm having a lot of trouble sleeping. So I'm really sensitive to the issue. So I think you can sleep well and you can fail to sleep well, but this doesn't make it an activity. So I was thinking about this as maybe a very stupid objection to premise number 2 in the argument for the lemma. I was just wondering how you could respond to this.
Yeah. So
because sorry, just one thing. I would still say that sleeping is a stream of behavior. That's the bit that maybe it's missing. I would describe sleeping as a kind of behavior, and I would say that it can be in intrinsic good order, but I wouldn't say that it is an activity.
Good. So so what this is pushing on. So look, the reason that it is the reason I don't say that it is an activity is because the if there is a motivational state that is guiding it, so sorry, the state that's guiding it, say, is more like a thermostat setting state. So there's a goal state that is guiding what your body is doing while you are asleep. But so say maybe it's, when people say this business about repairing neurons, that if you're an insomniac, so you're not supposed to say this to insomniacs because it'll make them worry and stay awake. But if you're insomniac, there are these various little kinds of nerve frayings that are not being repaired or so. So maybe what's happening is that these nerve frayings are being monitored and you're being kept down, right? And if something wakes you up, you're going to be kept down until a certain amount of this repair activity has happened in your brain or something like this. Yeah, suppose it's like that. So there is a goal state which is guiding what's happening, but that goal state is not a personal level state, right? So activities or actions, they require, and so what I'm appealing to here is Frankfurt's notion of an activity or action, which was opposed to Davidson's notion. So Davidson's notion is this: could have done otherwise. You could have chosen otherwise business. And it was just this big, exciting thing in the philosophy of action to move away from that to no guidance by a motivational state. But a motivational state is a personal level state of the subject. So an intention is an example of a motivational state.
Yeah.
Action. Yeah. I'll get back on the same page as you in a second. You can have a non-conceptual motivational state, which I call a need. Yeah. So we've got all of that. And so then the suggestion is that if there is intrinsic good order, right, by which I mean normative good order for a stream of behavior, then that is good order construed as aptness to the guiding motivational state, which requires a motivational state, which is what makes it an activity, right? In the sleeping case, you have got, say, regulation of what your body is doing by a goal-directed state, which is not a motivational state. So we can have good order construed as fitness or not for the to the goal, like well-functioning, good functioning relative to the goal. Now, what I need to say, given what this thing that Matteo is this is a really nice line of pressure point, right? What I need to say is that intrinsic good order of the kind that I'm claiming belief formation has, right, is not there when the goal setting state is not a motivational state of the subject. Yeah, and so there's actually a nice little problem there of how to make that precise, because a goal setting, yeah, and see a goal setting state, and then this hooks up with another obsession of mine, which I'll tell you. Then I'll just stop going on about this. But a goal setting state, you know, like the setting on a thermostat, a heating system. Yeah, you say the heating system is working properly or not. Okay, relative to whether or not it's generating fulfillment of the goal. So similarly, you might say, look, you're sleeping well or not, depending on whether your body is doing stuff that's appropriately, that's regulated in a way that's going to generate fulfillment of this goal. It's just the goal is not a personal level state. Okay, so what's the real difference between the this kind of intrinsic good order I'm wanting to talk about and the sort of good order you can talk about in the heating system or in sleep? Yeah. And something I really want, right, is for this kind of business about genuine activities versus genuine activities of ours versus just these sort of structurally similar things which are done by subsystems of us. I want to be able to characterize that difference, in various ways in terms of the difference that the fact that we are conscious makes to what is going on and the kind of good order that you can say that there is, right? So this is another place for me to be looking for the hook up to consciousness. Anyway, that's really interesting. So that was Matteo's alleged pedantic question and stupid question. The first was not pedantic, and the second was fascinating. All right. Yeah, thank you. I've written them down. See, I'm taking notes.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to Martha's question.
Thank you. I have just a curiosity. I was curious to know what you think about the relationship between belief formation and imaginings, because you've been talking about fiction and the way we engage with fiction, and there's all this debate about beliefs and a-leaves and states that fall in between. So just a curiosity about your view about these.
Yeah. This self-righteous thing I said earlier, that once you recognize that belief formation is an activity, then you should expect light to be shed upon the nature of the activity from consideration of pretense cases and failure cases. So imagination, I take it as a kind of pretense case. Yeah. Look, there are different types of imagination, but what is going to be, what is potentially going to sort of shed light on belief formation, from my point of view, or ordinary belief formation, is the possibility of imagination cases which do involve the ordinary belief formation information processing running within the scope of a pretense. Okay, and something like I said for the fiction case, there's ordinary uptake from testimony information processing running within the scope of genuine pretense. So something I've kind of toyed with, but I haven't got very far with yet, is the idea that some kinds of imagination, for example, visualization, right, might be a case of, it might stand in the relation to the perceptual demonstrative case that the fiction thing stands to the proper names case. You see, so that you get similar, you get a similar result out there. A reason that I haven't secured that, I haven't chased that up yet, is that I find the kind of claim that I think you can have about the fiction case is just it's much harder to get a kind of plausible baseline of things we want to say about imagination. So say a fiction case, there are these kind of long-standing debates about, debate people have about how much of the real world gets into fiction, and there's a limit on it, and there's something to those baseline claims people have been making in that area. Or there's this other thing about if you're reading a fiction and you're just reading along and there's a contradiction. So in and there's some famous cases of this, but in one famous case in English literature, there's this kind of prissy Jane Austen novel called Mansfield Park. And then here's Lady Bertram, and she's got a dog, which is a pug. And she says, oh, I was throwing the ball for Pug, and he, right, so Pug is a he, but then Pug has puppies, right? So the dog is male, but then pages later it's got puppies, and you're okay. So what do you do if you're reading? Right? Do you think, oh, her dog died and she got another one, or she got 2 dogs? No, you just kind of you sort of zoom out to the level at which, and this is good for me with my focus thing, right? You think, okay, she's got a dog, gender indeterminate. You zoom out to make the thing make sense, right? In imagination, those sorts of structural things about what the right or normal imaginative move is, they're much harder to see because imagination is more freewheeling, right? So if I say, look, see my dog asleep on the can you see my dog shamelessly sprawling on the couch? If I say, imagine she's a cat, right? Then you might be okay, and you might start off in some direction, but there's sort of nothing for me to hold you to if you're starting out in an imaginative exercise. Yeah, so I'm it's kind of tantalizing, the idea that the picture might be, and this would be sort of nice for me in a way, if the picture was, okay, look, fiction and proper names, yeah, visualization and perceptual demonstratives, yeah, and you could find these parallels, but I think, I don't know, I just find imagination much harder to think of as constrained in the sort of way that would let me, because imagination is fascinating and so on, but what I really want is an account of is an account of what makes it the case that you're thinking about the object in front of your face, yeah, and it's much harder for me to see how you might extract conclusions.
Okay, thank you. So I think that what made me think about imagination as something that could provide somehow partly a good model for your view about beliefs is that imagination is intuitively an activity more than belief forming. So it's just this idea of willingly engage in an activity that is clearly something that happens many times in imagination and is less intuitive in the case of belief forming. But anyway, I see the point. I perfectly see the point of imagination.
So I think that's right. And actually, so here's another way that imagination is relevant to this project here. So this, in the exchange with Matteo, I was, look, some motivational states are intentions, but there are these other motivational states, which I call needs, which they guide action, but they're not intentions. Intentions are propositional attitudes. And if you're going to make my view work, the claim can't be, oh, look, I intend to think about objects. So it can't be, I come along and I think, oh, I intend to think about that, because that would require me already to be thinking about it, right? So it rather has to be, there's a motivational state, which is a personal level motivational state, which is guiding my information processing when I form the belief that, or when you do what you do in response to a stream of testimony, but it's not an intention. Okay, so what is it? And why should we think that there is such a thing? And one of the reasons for thinking that there is such a thing is just, imagine that imagine you haven't got enough to think about. Well, what's one of the ways that you end up with, imagine you're locked up, imagine you're locked in a room and nothing to look at. Here's your little mind. It's got nothing to think about. It's going to get very, very unhappy on my view, because the mind needs, right? It needs to achieve cognitive focus and engage in cognitive focus sustaining activity. And one of the things that you can do when this need pressure becomes intolerable because you haven't got enough to think about is imagine. Right? So an argument for the claim that there is this motivational state of needing cognitive focus is the fact that you can alleviate motivational pressure by engaging in, by telling yourself a little story, right? Engaging in pretense of focused activity.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marta. I don't see any other question in the chat, so maybe it's time for me just to conclude with. I had two questions just as Matteo, but the first one is pedantic as well. So since we are running out of time, I just keep it. For it's basically a question about terminology. But my main question, which is probably a bit more substantive, has to do with a case that has been described by Susanna Siegel in her book on perception. And it's actually a case, she calls it as a case of amazing coincidence, but it's actually a new version of Lewis' idea that there are what he called the veridical imaginations. Veridical hallucinations. And those cases seem to point out that there are situations in which everything in your definition concerning cognitive focus works, but still you don't have sufficient conditions in order to have aboutness secured. But suppose I give you the case that Susanna proposes. Suppose that I am in front of an airport, but even though I am in front of an airport, I'm suffering from an hallucination that completely resembles a perception that I would have if I were causally connected with the airport. So it's just an hallucination that completely resembles, so to speak, the scenario that I am actually facing. And simply it is an hallucination that I don't recognize as such. I think that it is a perception, even though it is an hallucination. So it seems to be that in this case, if I'm not wrong, I form a belief that I justify exactly in the same, in the usual way in which I justify a belief, and in which I would justify that belief if I had a perception. And there is an object which, in point of fact, satisfies whatever I'm forming in my belief. For the airport that I'm facing actually has all the qualities that I am attributing to something in my mental state, in my hallucination. But still, one would say that whatever is my mental state, since it is an hallucination, is not about the real airport. It is about an hallucinated airport or whatever. And by the way, from a terminological point of view, one might reformulate Peter Geach's original example of intentional identity, in which he spoke in the end of a situation in which the different subjects that are involved share what he called a common focus. You know, the case in which there is, I can't remember now, Hobbes believes that there is a witch, blah, 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 and Cobb believes that the witches, and so on and so forth. I can't remember the details. But one might suppose, one might reformulate that case by supposing that all the subjects that are involved are suffering from something like a veridical hallucination of the same kind. There is, in point of fact, there is a woman in front of them, but simply they are not causally connected to that woman, and still they attribute to what they are commonly hallucinating properties that, in point of fact, are possessed uniquely by that woman. So I would like to know what you think about this case.
Okay, so this connects with issue that was running along the side on the exchange with Julia about
yeah, sure.
So a kind of longer version of my aboutness and justification principle would be, look, you've got aboutness where you've got a if and only if the means of justification is such that you'll be unlucky to get the object's properties wrong and not merely lucky to get them right.
Okay.
Yeah. So so in this case, what you've got is a situation which is rationally irrelevant. So we shouldn't go around checking whether we're hallucinating. It'll end up being Republicans in the US and refusing vaccination. So don't go around suspecting that actually you're hallucinating all the time and guarding against that possibility. So the possibility of a like very, very realistic hallucination, and in whatever the scenario is, this is not a rationally relevant possibility.
Okay.
If you are in that situation, then you're in a situation where you're merely lucky to be getting
Right, exactly.
really merely lucky to get a match, and a setup which generates a merely lucky match doesn't sustain aboutness. It's going to be the picture. What was the pedantic question? Was that
Well, the pedantic question is just a question of terminology. I'm used since I follow, say, the phenomenological approach to aboutness.
Yeah.
So I'm along with people like, say, A.D. Smith or Tim Crane in saying that aboutness is not something that has, it's not a notion that is connected with successful conditions. So for me, in my approach, an hallucination is about something just in the very same sense in which a perception is such. But I wonder, this is just the terminological issue. Of course, you don't share this notion of aboutness, but according to these people, there is a second notion that they appeal to, in particular Tim calls it reference. And he says that reference is just a factive notion that applies only to perception, but not to hallucination. So in the case of hallucination, one might precisely say that hallucination is a sort of unsuccessful attempt at referring to something, whereas perception is a successful attempt at referring to something. So I wonder whether what you said as far as your notion of aboutness is concerned, more or less matches what Tim has in mind when he talks about this notion of reference, as applied, say, to mental states rather than to linguistic terms.
Well, right. So, I am happy with for the notion of if we're talking about propositional attitudes, to say, okay, there's aboutness. Okay, that's a success term, and so that is if there's no object there that you're thinking about, then there's no and then there can be indistinguishability from aboutness, and my justificatory story is intact. Now, I think that thing that Tim says, which is that you can go from I'm thinking about Pegasus to therefore there is a thing Pegasus I'm thinking about, is a monstrosity. But you don't agree with that, do you?
I completely agree with you. I take it that Tim's position is an unstable one. So
right, because also the Italian I live with says, so if I say, because you would say I'm thinking too, right? I'm thinking to Pegasus, directing my thoughts to Pegasus. Can my thoughts be directed to what is in fact nothing? Yes, right. So and I don't want to talk about aboutness and reference for perception at all, because I'm not a representationalist about perception. So I think that you have a perceptual relation to an object, but perception doesn't itself represent.
Okay.
But that's another story.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I think that we have definitely run out of time, so maybe it's time now to thank Imogen once again very much for a very stimulating talk. Since our project I was speaking about at the very beginning of your talk will last at least 1 year and a half, I hope that there will be other opportunities for us to meet and to invite you, hopefully in person.
That would be
you
lovely.
will be able to be in Europe sometime.
Thank you for this excellent discussion. For the first half of this, this is the first time, and it's going to be better next time, thanks to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Goodbye.